The first time my husband humiliated me in public. It wasn't with shouting. It was with laughter. Not the kind that slips out by accident. Not the nervous kind people use to soften tension. It was deliberate. Polished. Timed perfectly between a sip of champagne and the clink of crystal glasses on a rooftop in downtown Chicago. The skyline glittered behind him like it was part of the performance. "Stephanie designs beautiful dresses," Kevin said, smiling as investors leaned in. "But when it comes to scaling a company, I leave that to people who actually understand tech." The table laughed. Hannah laughed the loudest. She stood beside him in a red dress sharp enough to cut glass, her hand resting lightly on the back of his chair, as if she had always belonged there. 30 years old. Hospital administrator. Newly promoted operations director at my husband's health tech startup. Strategic. Efficient. Necessary. At least. That's how he introduced her. I felt every eye shift toward me, waiting to see how the designer wife would respond. The creative one. The cute one. The one who, apparently, only knew how to sew. Kevin didn't look at me when the laughter settled. He just lifted his glass. "To vision," he said. And that was the moment I realized I had married a man who no longer saw me standing beside him. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't make a scene. I simply smiled, leaned forward just enough for him to hear me over the music, and said, "I hope you read the equity clause you signed last year." Then I stood up and walked away while they were still laughing. They didn't notice when the phone started ringing. 10 years earlier, Kevin and I had been two broke students sharing a one-bedroom apartment with peeling paint and second-hand furniture. He wrote code at the kitchen table. I sketched dress patterns on the floor beside him. We were a team then. He built software, I built identity. When he decided to launch his medical data platform, I drained my savings to cover early development costs. I designed the logo, the pitch decks, the brand story. I introduced him to clients through the private fashion healthcare network I'd built quietly over years of styling charity galas and donor events. We were what magazines like to call a power couple. Young, ambitious, complementary. The company grew. So did Kevin's ego. When Hannah joined the startup 2 years ago, she didn't come in loudly. She didn't need to. She understood hospital procurement systems, compliance reporting, clinical partnerships. She spoke in data. She wore tailored suits. She stayed late. She also learned quickly where to apply pressure. Fashion is adorable. She once told me during a company mixer, smiling as if it were a compliment. It's just not exactly scalable. Kevin laughed then too. At first, the changes were subtle. He stopped asking for my opinion on funding decisions. He closed the door during investor calls. He referred to my brand as my little creative venture. When the company restructured its equity ahead of a projected Series B raise, I insisted on reviewing the documents. Not because I didn't trust him, because I understand contracts. Buried in the amended shareholder agreement was a clause I drafted with our attorney's approval. If company assets were used for unauthorized personal expenditures, or if executive conduct created material legal exposure affecting valuation, a secondary shareholder, me, could initiate financial oversight and trigger internal audit review. Kevin signed it without reading beyond the summary page. He trusted me. Or maybe he underestimated me. On the night of our 10th anniversary, he claimed the rooftop dinner was to celebrate us. Instead, it felt like a soft launch of his future without me in it. Hannah stood close enough to him that their shoulders brushed. Investors asked her questions directly. Kevin deferred to her in conversations that once would have included me. Then came the toast, the joke, the laughter. After I left the table, I didn't storm out of the restaurant. I stepped into the hallway, called a rideshare, and opened my email. I already suspected something was wrong. Over the past 3 months, I had noticed budget discrepancies in public filings, conference expenses that didn't align with announced events, travel reimbursements labeled under vague medical symposiums that didn't appear on any legitimate registry. I went home and pulled the company's internal reporting dashboard, access I still legally retained as a shareholder. The numbers told a different story. There were clinical outreach conferences that had never occurred. Vendor contracts tied to shell consulting groups. Early product performance metrics projected in investor updates that exceeded internal testing data by margins too clean to be coincidence. And there were emails. Hannah suggesting they accelerate release announcements to create investor urgency. Kevin agreeing that the narrative matters more than the interim metrics. They hadn't stolen millions, but they had bent truth just enough to inflate perception. In a company preparing for major funding, perception is valuation. Valuation is leverage. Leverage is risk. I didn't send threats. I didn't confront Kevin. I compiled documentation. I created a secure file and forwarded it anonymously to 2 lead investors, citing concerns about reporting inconsistencies and requesting formal audit review under shareholder protection provisions. Then I triggered the clause. Internal audit became mandatory. Within 48 hours, Kevin's phone began ringing during board meetings. Compliance officers requested documentation. One investor postponed the funding vote pending review. By the time Kevin returned home 3 nights later, his face had lost its rooftop confidence. "What did you do?" he asked. I was sitting at the dining table, calm. "I stopped protecting you," I said. He stared at me as if I had become someone else. But I hadn't changed. I had simply turned on the light. And once the light is on, everything looks different. Kevin didn't sleep that night. I heard him pacing between the kitchen and the living room long after midnight. The low vibration of his phone breaking the silence every few minutes. Each time it buzzed, he would check the screen, type something quickly, then start walking again. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening. 6 months earlier, I would have gotten up, made coffee, asked what was wrong, offered to review the numbers with him. I would have tried to solve it. That was our rhythm. His crisis, my analysis, his ambition, my structure. That night, I stayed still. By morning, the audit request had been formally acknowledged by the board. The email subject line was clinical and precise. Immediate review of financial reporting protocols under shareholder oversight provision. Kevin read it out loud at the kitchen island, as if hearing the words might change them. "They're initiating a full compliance review," he said, rubbing his forehead. "They think we misrepresented early pilot data." "You did accelerate the projections," I replied. He looked at me sharply. It wasn't misrepresentation. It was forward-looking positioning. Forward-looking positioning. I almost smiled at the phrasing. "And the conferences?" I asked quietly. "The ones that don't exist on any medical registry." He hesitated for half a second too long. "Hannah handled those vendor arrangements," he said. "They were outreach initiatives." "Under which hospital system?" He didn't answer. That silence told me more than the spreadsheets had. By noon, the internal Slack channels were filled with rumors. Someone had flagged expense inconsistencies. Someone had mentioned external oversight. Someone had used the word exposure. Hannah called him 3 times before he picked up. "I told you we should have waited on the announcement." Her voice carried faintly through the speaker as he stepped into his office. "If the investors start digging now, they'll question everything." "Lower your voice," Kevin snapped. "It's just a review." "It's never just a review." I sat at the dining table with my laptop open, not listening intentionally, just existing in the same space. That used to bother him. My presence during work calls, my quiet observation. Now it made him uneasy. By evening, the first investor meeting was scheduled for the following day. Mandatory attendance. Executive team only. That included Hannah. It did not include me, which was fine, because my involvement had already been written into the process. The audit firm arrived 2 days later. 3 consultants in navy suits. Polite and efficient. They requested access to expense reports, vendor contracts, internal communications related to product testing and marketing projections. Kevin tried to frame it as procedural. "We're tightening compliance before Series B," he told the team in a company-wide message. "This is a sign of growth. But growth doesn't usually come with frozen discretionary spending. Or with the operations director's calendar suddenly cleared for documentation review. I watched from the outside as the story shifted. Investors who once praised Kevin's bold expansion began asking cautious questions. Timelines were reassessed. Press interviews postponed. The projected valuation quietly adjusted downward in draft documents. Hannah stopped coming home after midnight. She began staying at hotels closer to the hospital partners. According to Kevin, one evening, he came home earlier than usual and stood in the doorway of my studio room while I was finishing a custom gown for a client in New York. "You could have talked to me," he said. I didn't look up from the fabric. "About what?" "About the audit." "I didn't initiate it because of the audit," I said. "I initiated it because you used company resources in ways that triggered the clause." He stepped closer. "You're making this bigger than it is." "Am I?" He exhaled sharply. Hannah pushed for aggressive scaling. I trusted her judgment. "And you didn't trust mine." "That's not what this is about." I finally met his eyes. "Then what is it about?" "Kevin." He didn't answer. Because we both knew it wasn't just about numbers. It was about credibility, about who he believed understood power. The next week, the auditors requested email archives between Kevin and Hannah over the past 9 months. That was when the tension changed. I saw it in the way he avoided eye contact, in the way he started rereading old messages on his phone at night, in the way he stopped defending her quite so confidently. "They're misinterpreting context," he said once, almost to himself. "Context rarely survives documentation." Within 10 days, preliminary findings were delivered to the board. Certain expense classifications lacked adequate documentation. Some pilot data summaries used language inconsistent with raw metrics. Vendor relationships required clarification. Nothing criminal, but enough to justify postponing the funding round. Series B, which had been months from closing, was now under review. Valuation dropped 20% in revised projections. Kevin sat at the kitchen counter with his laptop open, staring at the new numbers. "This is temporary," he muttered. "Once we clear this up, it'll bounce back." Maybe, but investors don't forget instability. And startups survive on confidence. Hannah called again that night. "I can't take the fall for this," she said, her voice sharp and strained. "You approved every announcement." Kevin ran a hand through his hair. "We aligned on strategy. That's not what the auditors are saying." Their conversation grew quieter after that. For the first time, I saw doubt in him, not about the company, but about her. He began asking her for documentation she had once managed independently. He requested detailed reports instead of accepting summaries. The trust that had formed between them, professional or otherwise, was thinning. I didn't intervene. I didn't gloat. I kept working on my own contracts, my own expansion plans. A potential flagship space in New York had become available, and negotiations were progressing faster than expected. One night, Kevin stood in the doorway again, watching me sketch. "They're considering appointing an interim COO," he said. "For oversight," I replied. "For optics," he corrected. Optics. I had heard that word before. He leaned against the wall, looking older than 37. "Did you ever plan to tell me?" he asked quietly. "About the clause?" "Yes. I assumed you read it." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Of course you did." There it was. The realization, not that I betrayed him, but that I had never been as uninformed as he believed. The audit continued. The phones kept ringing, and the laughter from that rooftop dinner felt very far away. The first time I met Hannah, she wore navy instead of red. It was at a small hospital partnership launch 2 years before the rooftop dinner, when Kevin's startup was still trying to prove it belonged in rooms filled with seasoned administrators and cautious medical directors. She stood near the refreshment table with a tablet tucked under her arm, listening more than she spoke. When Kevin introduced us, she smiled warmly. "I've heard so much about you," she said. "You're the creative force behind the brand." Creative force. It sounded complimentary. It wasn't. That night, Kevin and I drove home talking about workflow integration and hospital compliance protocols. He seemed energized by her insights. She understands how hospital systems actually make decisions, he said. That's what we need. I nodded. At the time, I agreed. I didn't see her as competition. I saw her as infrastructure. The shift began gradually. Hannah started joining more investor calls. She restructured internal reporting dashboards. She introduced operational efficiency language that impressed the board. Kevin began quoting her during dinner. Hannah thinks we should pivot the rollout strategy. Hannah pointed out that hospital purchasing cycles are more seasonal than we assumed. Hannah believes our current valuation could double if we reposition the narrative. Her name became a constant presence in our conversations. Mine faded. The first time I felt something fracture wasn't romantic jealousy. It was professional dismissal. We were hosting a small gathering at our apartment for early backers. I had prepared a detailed branding refresh proposal that aligned product messaging with hospital aesthetics and physician trust cues. It was smart, strategic, data supported. Kevin skimmed it. It's beautiful, he said. But we need to focus on scalability, not visuals. Before I could respond, Hannah leaned over the kitchen counter. Branding matters, she said gently. But hospitals don't buy based on color palettes. A few investors chuckled. Kevin smiled. And just like that, my contribution shifted from strategic to decorative. After that evening, he stopped looping me into pitch rehearsals. He stopped asking for my review before major announcements. When I requested updated cap table summaries ahead of the equity restructure, he seemed almost surprised. Why do you need that? He asked. Because I'm a shareholder, I replied. He looked briefly uncomfortable, then forwarded the documents. That was when I noticed the first discrepancy. Travel reimbursements categorized under Clinical Outreach Symposium. Phoenix. I knew every major healthcare conference by name. Phoenix had none scheduled that quarter. I asked Kevin casually. It was a smaller industry roundtable, he said. Hannah coordinated it. Which hospital system hosted it? He shrugged. I don't remember. That answer lingered. A month later, Hannah's social media showed her in Napa during what was listed internally as Vendor Negotiation Summit, Northern California. The background in her photo wasn't a conference center. It was a vineyard. I didn't confront anyone then. I saved screenshots. The emotional distance between Kevin and me widened in quieter ways. He began staying late more often. When he came home, he was tired but alert, still vibrating from boardroom energy. You wouldn't understand how intense it's getting, he said one night when I asked about revised projections. Try me, I wanted to say. Instead, I asked for updated financial summaries. He hesitated before sharing them. That hesitation told me everything. The restructuring of equity happened shortly after. The company was preparing for its largest funding round yet. Lawyers were involved. Documents circulated rapidly. I requested revisions to include a marital asset protection provision tied specifically to executive misconduct or misappropriation of company funds. Kevin laughed when I explained it. You think I'd jeopardize my own company? He asked. I think rapid growth increases pressure, I replied. He signed without argument. Maybe he thought it was symbolic. Maybe he thought it was unnecessary. Or maybe he simply believed he would never need to worry about the consequences of overlooking details. Hannah's presence in his life became more visible after that. She attended investor dinners. She appeared in press interviews standing just slightly closer than appropriate. Her language when speaking about the company shifted subtly from the team to we. At home, Kevin started defending her before I criticized her. She's ambitious, he said once. You can't fault her for wanting impact. I'm not faulting ambition, I replied. I'm questioning transparency. He bristled at that word. Transparency. It hung between us like a challenge. One evening, I found an expense line labeled Executive Strategic Retreat, Aspen. The dates coincided with what he had told me was a late-night product testing sprint in Chicago. I didn't confront him. I checked hotel billing addresses linked to the corporate card. I saw Hannah's name listed as primary guest for the reservation. That was the moment something inside me recalibrated. Not heartbreak. Calculation. I understood then that this wasn't simply about emotional betrayal. It was about structural risk, about blurred lines between corporate funds and personal entanglements. When Kevin later dismissed my fashion contracts as side revenue, I realized he had already compartmentalized me out of the core of his world. He underestimated my awareness. He underestimated my patience. By the time the rooftop dinner arrived, I already knew enough to trigger oversight. The humiliation didn't start the collapse. It finalized my decision to stop shielding him from it. And when I walked away from that table, I wasn't walking into uncertainty. I was walking toward activation. The board meeting was scheduled for 8:30 on a Monday morning. Kevin left before sunrise. Suit pressed. Jaw tight. Phone already buzzing. He didn't ask if I would be home when he returned. He didn't ask for advice. He just paused at the door as if he might say something, then thought better of it. By then, the audit had moved from routine review to formal inquiry. I poured coffee and opened my laptop at the kitchen table, reviewing the timeline I had assembled over the past week. Vendor payments, travel reimbursements, email threads flagged by keyword filters, acceleration, optics, pre-release, aggressive positioning. I wasn't looking for destruction. I was documenting pattern. At 9:12, my phone lit up with a news alert from an industry blog. Reinhardt Health Tech delays Series B amid compliance review. So it had reached the press. Not details. Just enough to create questions. Byton. Kevin texted. Board is asking for full breakdown of vendor expenses. At 10:30, another message. They're bringing in external compliance counsel. At 11, silence. I imagined the room. Polished conference table, muted walls. The company logo projected behind Kevin as if it could shield him. Investors seated evenly spaced. No one smiling. Hannah across from him. I had watched her in board meetings before. Calm, precise, confident in her numbers. She rarely stumbled. But documentation is different than presentation. Shortly after noon, my email pinged with a formal notice. As a shareholder under the oversight clause, I was entitled to receive summarized findings at the conclusion of each audit phase. Kevin had forgotten that detail too. Phase 1 findings arrived at 4:30. Inconsistent vendor documentation for 3 out-of-state clinical summits. Marketing projections framed as current pilot metrics in at least 2 investor updates. Executive travel expenses categorized under outreach initiatives without hospital affiliation confirmation. Nothing criminal, but enough to constitute material misrepresentation risk. I read the document twice. Then I closed my laptop. Kevin came home at nearly 8. He looked exhausted. But there was something else beneath it. Confusion. They're overreacting, he said, tossing his keys onto the counter. This happens in every startup. Everyone pushes metrics a little. A little, I repeated. He ran a hand through his hair. You know how funding works. Investors want momentum. If you show hesitation, they walk. And if you show inflated data, he didn't answer. Instead, he said, Hannah's handling most of the documentation requests. She's better at operational reporting. Operational reporting. That phrase had once described me in his world. Over the next week, the company's internal environment shifted visibly. Slack channels grew cautious. Conversations moved to private threads. Department heads requested clarification on spending approvals. An interim compliance officer was appointed temporarily. Kevin's name remained on the leadership page of the website, but press interviews were paused. The second audit phase focused on communications. Emails were reviewed for intent. Context rarely helps once language is frozen in time. I received an updated summary 3 days later. There were exchanges between Kevin and Hannah discussing narrative framing ahead of investor calls. Suggestions to streamline early data into digestible impact statements. A message from Hannah recommending they announce hospital partnerships before finalizing signed agreements to create urgency. Kevin had responded. Let's move forward. We'll adjust the details after. Adjust the details after. I read that line 3 times. When Kevin returned home that evening, he didn't immediately speak. He went straight to the refrigerator, poured water, and stood with his back to me. "They're considering freezing discretionary executive authority," he said quietly. "For optics?" I asked. "For stability." There it was. The shift in language. He no longer said they were overreacting. He no longer dismissed the risk. Instead, he began distancing himself from decisions. "Hannah pushed for the early announcement," he said. "She was aggressive about it." "You signed off," I replied. He turned slowly. "So did you, when you approved the oversight clause?" "Yes," I said. "I did." The difference was intention. I didn't say that aloud. By Friday, the investors had scheduled an emergency review session without media presence. Only executive leadership and legal counsel. Hannah left the apartment early that morning without calling Kevin. He checked his phone repeatedly throughout the day. At 2:30, I received Phase 3 findings. Preliminary conclusion. While no definitive evidence of fraud was identified, there was sufficient documentation irregularity to warrant postponement of funding and restructuring of executive authority pending further compliance alignment. Postponement. Restructuring. Executive authority. 3 words capable of shifting an empire. Kevin walked in just after 6. "They're appointing an interim COO," he said flatly. "For oversight," I replied. "For control," he corrected. Hannah had not been present for the final vote. She had submitted documentation remotely. Kevin sat down across from me at the dining table. "They're treating this like we lied," he said. "Did you—" He hesitated. "We stretched," he said finally. That was the closest he had come to honesty. "And the travel expenses?" I asked. He closed his eyes briefly. "They're reviewing those separately," which meant they hadn't cleared them. Silence filled the space between us. Outside, traffic moved normally. The city didn't care about compliance reviews or postponed funding rounds. But inside our apartment, something irreversible had begun. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," Kevin said quietly. I believed him. Intent doesn't prevent consequence. I stood, walked to the window, and looked down at the streetlights. "You didn't think it would?" I said. "Behind me." His phone buzzed again. He didn't reach for it immediately. For the first time since the rooftop dinner, I saw fear replace confidence. And once fear enters a structure built on momentum, everything slows. The night the interim COO was announced, the apartment felt unfamiliar. Kevin stood in the living room staring at the press release draft on his phone, reading the same paragraph over and over as if repetition might change its tone. "Effective immediately," he muttered. "Interim oversight to reinforce investor confidence." Reinforce investor confidence. The polite version of "we don't trust you." He looked up at me. "They didn't remove me," he said quickly. "It's temporary. Temporary structures still change foundations," I replied. He flinched at that. The announcement went live at 9 the next morning. Industry blogs framed it cautiously. Reinhardt Health Tech adjusts leadership structure amid internal review. Not a scandal. Not yet. But momentum had shifted. Within hours, a former client of mine, one of the hospital network executives I had introduced Kevin to years ago, texted me. "I saw the news. Everything okay?" I stared at the message longer than necessary. "We're fine. Just compliance updates." It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. Kevin spent the next week in a controlled spiral. He attended meetings but no longer led them. He approved strategy drafts that were rewritten by the interim COO. He forwarded emails instead of crafting them. Hannah, meanwhile, became less visible. Her LinkedIn activity stopped. Her name no longer appeared in internal announcements. When I asked Kevin if she had been formally reprimanded, he hesitated. "They're reviewing her operational decisions separately," he said. "Separately from yours." "Yes." Which meant she was not insulated. 2 days later, The audit firm requested direct clarification on executive travel expenditures from the previous fiscal quarter. They wanted receipts, itineraries, conference documentation, vendor contracts. Kevin stayed up late compiling files. At one point, I walked past his office and saw him scrolling through old email threads with Hannah. Jaw tight. "Did you confirm the hospital affiliation for Napa?" he typed. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. No response. The following morning, Phase 4 findings were circulated to the board and summarized to shareholders. Unverified conference expenditures totaling 6 figures. Vendor payments routed through a consulting intermediary lacking formal registration. Incomplete documentation of partnership claims used in investor presentations. Again, no criminal charges. But cumulative risk. Risk reduces valuation. Valuation reduces leverage. Leverage was everything to a startup approaching Series B. Kevin came home earlier than usual that evening. "They're postponing the funding indefinitely," he said. Indefinitely. That word carried more weight than temporary. "The interim COO is assuming control of external communications," he continued. "I'll remain on product strategy." Remain, not lead. "Are they investigating Hannah directly?" I asked. He exhaled slowly. "Yes." The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument we'd had. "You trusted her," I said. "She understood the operational side." "And I didn't." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. That was the answer. Later that week, the board requested that Kevin step back from discretionary financial authority pending final audit clearance. He tried to frame it as collaborative restructuring when speaking to the team. But internally, control had shifted. Hannah officially resigned 3 days later. The resignation email cited personal reasons and commitment to preserving organizational stability. Her name was removed from the leadership page within hours. Her LinkedIn profile disappeared entirely within a week. No public confrontation. No dramatic exit. Just erasure. Kevin didn't speak about her at home. He didn't defend her anymore either. Instead, he began speaking about damage control. "If we can stabilize metrics over the next quarter, we might recover part of the valuation," he said one night, pacing again. "Might," I repeated. He stopped walking. "You didn't have to push it this far," he said quietly. "I didn't push," I replied. "I activated." He shook his head. "You knew what would happen." "Yes." "And you did it anyway." I met his eyes. "You humiliated me publicly and used company resources irresponsibly. What outcome did you expect?" His shoulders dropped. "I thought we'd fix it internally." "We could have," I said. "If you had been honest before the audit." That was the fracture. Not the clause, not the investors. Honesty. By the end of the month, revised valuation estimates circulated among potential backers, down nearly 30% from original projections. News outlets updated headlines. Funding delayed amid reporting irregularities. Irregularities. A clean word for messy consequences. Kevin began sleeping on the couch. Not because I asked him to. Because proximity felt unbearable. One evening, I placed a stack of papers on the dining table. A lease draft for a New York flagship studio. A partnership agreement with a private medical aesthetics group. A projected revenue forecast for my next collection. He looked at them slowly. "You're leaving Chicago," he said. "I'm expanding." "That's not the same." "It is for me." He sat down across from me. The same place he had stood with confidence months earlier. "Do you still want this marriage?" he asked. I didn't answer immediately, because the truth had already been forming long before the rooftop dinner. "I wanted a partner," I said finally. "Not someone who thought I was ornamental." He swallowed hard. "I never thought that." "You didn't have to say it," I replied. Outside. The city moved as always. Inside. The structure we had built together was dismantling piece by piece, not by explosion, but by exposure. The interim COO scheduled another strategy meeting for the following week. Kevin's role was listed third on the agenda. Third. He stared at the notification on his phone for a long time. "I built this," he said quietly. "I know," I answered. "And sometimes the thing you build collapses not because someone attacks it, but because you forgot who helped hold it up." The divorce conversation began with paperwork. Not shouting. I placed the folder on the dining table on a quiet Sunday morning, while Kevin was scrolling through revised projections on his laptop. He looked up when the folder slid toward him. "What's that?" he asked. "Clarity," I replied. Inside were 2 documents. A formal separation proposal drafted by my attorney, and a printed copy of the shareholder clause he had signed the previous year. He stared at the second document first. "You're serious," he said quietly. "I've been serious for a long time." He closed his laptop slowly, as if the act of shutting it might delay the rest of the conversation. "You're leaving because of the company?" he asked. "I'm leaving because of you." He winced. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" Silence stretched between us. He leaned back in his chair and ran his hands over his face. "I made mistakes," he said. "But we can fix this." "You fixed your company by bringing in oversight," I said. "You fix a marriage by bringing in honesty." He didn't argue. He couldn't. Because honesty would require admitting more than misclassified expenses. It would require admitting that somewhere along the way, he stopped seeing me as equal. Over the next week, the legal logistics unfolded with sterile efficiency. Asset evaluations, equity division assessments, timeline coordination. We had built more together than I think either of us realized. Joint investments, shared intellectual property from early branding work, property equity in the Chicago apartment. There was no screaming, no dramatic throwing of objects, just signatures and silence. Meanwhile, the company moved into formal restructuring. The interim COO measured. Older, experienced, began reviewing all prior executive approvals. Press releases were rewritten with cautious language. Growth projections recalibrated conservatively. Kevin's title shifted officially from co-founder and CEO to co-founder and chief product officer. A lateral move on paper. A demotion in reality. Investors praised the restructuring as a responsible step toward governance stability. Governance stability. That phrase trended briefly in industry circles. I watched the language change from my own perspective, not with anger, but with detachment. Kevin returned home late one night after a tense board session and found me packing archived design samples into labeled boxes. "You already signed the lease in New York?" he asked. "Yes." "When are you leaving?" "In 3 weeks." He nodded slowly. "Absorbing it." "I never thought you'd actually walk away," he said. "I didn't either," I replied. He stood there for a moment, then asked quietly, "Was there a point where we could have stopped this?" "Yes." "When?" "The first time you laughed." He looked down at the floor. The truth about that rooftop dinner wasn't that it embarrassed me. It confirmed what had already been happening in private. The divorce filing became official 2 weeks later. No public drama followed. Industry blogs were too focused on the company's funding delay to care about personal developments. Hannah's name appeared briefly in a compliance memo circulated internally to staff. Her departure had been voluntary. But under review recommendations, she had not contacted Kevin in days. He didn't mention her anymore. One evening, as we sat on opposite ends of the couch, finalizing asset distribution details, he spoke without looking at me. "I didn't think you'd actually use the clause. I didn't think I'd have to. I thought it was symbolic. It was structural," I corrected. He exhaled sharply. "You always saw the architecture behind things," he said. "Yes," I answered. I did. That was what he had once admired about me. Somewhere along the way, he began resenting it instead. The last week in Chicago felt suspended in time. Boxes stacked against walls. Wardrobe racks emptied. The studio room that once held bolts of silk and unfinished sketches now bare and echoing. Kevin moved through the apartment quietly, as if already living somewhere else. On my final evening before departure, he stood in the doorway of the bedroom. "I don't hate you," he said. I don't hate you either. Then what is this? It's consequence. He nodded slowly. I was arrogant. He admitted. Yes. I thought I was untouchable. I know. He stepped further into the room. I didn't realize you were holding so much together. I looked at him steadily. You didn't realize I was holding you accountable. That was the difference. The following morning, I loaded the last suitcase into the car. He helped without speaking. At the door, he paused. Will the company survive? He asked. Yes, I said. But it won't be what you imagined. And you, I'll build something better. He studied my face as if trying to see whether that was confidence or bravado. It was neither. It was certainty. I drove toward the airport just after sunrise. Chicago's skyline receded in the rearview mirror. The same skyline that had glittered behind him during the rooftop toast. The laughter felt distant now, muted. What remained was clarity. I hadn't destroyed his company. I had removed the illusion that growth without integrity could sustain itself. And I hadn't left because of Hannah. I left because I finally understood that love without respect is just performance. The plane lifted off, and for the first time in months, the air felt steady. New York smelled different from Chicago. Sharper, faster, less forgiving. I unlocked the glass door of my new studio space in Soho on a gray Monday morning. The lease officially in my name. The floor still echoing with emptiness. Sunlight filtered through tall industrial windows, illuminating dust in the air like suspended possibility. For the first time in years, the room was entirely mine. No shared branding strategy. No investor decks. No operational compromises. Just space. I set my bag down on the polished concrete floor and stood still, listening to the hum of the city outside. Construction noise. Taxi horns. Footsteps on pavement. Movement without permission. Within days, installation began. Racks arrived. Mirrors were mounted. Fabric shipments stacked against walls. I signed partnership agreements with a private medical aesthetics group interested in designing post-procedure couture recovery garments. Structured, elegant, functional, fashion and healthcare. The irony was quiet but satisfying. My team was small but deliberate. A pattern maker from Brooklyn with surgical precision. A production manager who had worked with European houses before relocating. An intern who didn't laugh when I mentioned scaling strategy. Scaling. That word had once been used to diminish me. Now it was part of my language again. Press inquiries trickled in after an industry article mentioned my expansion in the context of entrepreneurs rebuilding after high-profile corporate fallout. I didn't grant interviews about the divorce. I spoke about resilience. Kevin texted occasionally. Board-approved final restructuring plan. Valuation stabilized at revised estimate. We're negotiating partial secondary sale. The messages were informational, neutral. I responded politely. Meanwhile, the company he built was becoming something smaller. More controlled, less aggressive. The interim COO maintained oversight. Compliance processes were strengthened. Investor updates were conservative. Reputation, once inflated, was recalibrated. Hannah resurfaced briefly in a compliance filing. Formal review concluded that while no criminal intent was established, certain executive decisions reflected inadequate documentation standards inconsistent with governance best practices. Her professional profile remained inactive. No apology. No confrontation. Just quiet removal. One afternoon, as I reviewed design samples for our flagship launch event, I received an unexpected email from a journalist. We're doing a piece on women underestimated in male-dominated industries. Would you be open to sharing perspective? I read the message twice. I agreed. The interview took place in my half-furnished studio. Bolts of silk visible behind me. Cutting tables arranged precisely. The journalist asked about entrepreneurship, about strategic oversight, about balancing creative and financial authority. She did not ask about Hannah. She did not ask about Kevin. I didn't offer those names. Instead, I said, when someone underestimates your understanding of structure, They mistake silence for absence. The quote circulated more widely than I expected. It appeared in a leadership blog, then in a business newsletter. Kevin forwarded it to me with a single line. "That sounds like you." I didn't reply. Weeks later, my flagship launch event approached. Invitations went out to clients, medical partners, select fashion editors. The night of the opening, the studio was warm with conversation. Champagne glasses clinked. Soft music filled the space. Guests admired structured silhouettes displayed beneath strategic lighting. No one laughed at me. No one questioned whether I understood scale. A hospital executive approached near the center of the room. "I heard about the compliance situation," she said quietly. "You handled it strategically." "I handled it legally," I replied. She nodded with approval. Across the room, I caught my reflection in the mirror mounted behind the central display. Composed. Present. Unapologetic. Not triumphant. Stable. Later that evening, Kevin called. "I saw photos," he said. "It looks incredible." "Thank you. I didn't realize how much your network respected you." "That wasn't the issue," I said gently. "You didn't realize how much I respected myself." Silence settled between us. "The board finalized the secondary sale," he said after a moment. "I'm stepping back further. Product oversight only." It was the final shift. From leader to contributor. "I hope it works out," I said. "Do you?" "Yes," he exhaled. "I used to think ambition meant pushing until something gave," he said quietly. "And now I think I pushed the wrong thing." We ended the call without bitterness. Just acknowledgement. The studio emptied around midnight. My team left one by one, congratulating each other. The space grew quiet again, but no longer empty. I walked through the room slowly, adjusting a mannequin, straightening a garment sleeve, smoothing fabric edges. Outside, New York moved relentlessly forward. Inside, I felt no urgency. Kevin's company had not collapsed entirely. It had contracted. It had recalibrated. And in that recalibration, he had lost the version of himself that believed growth excused everything. I locked the studio door and stepped onto the sidewalk. The city lights reflected in the glass behind me. Months ago, under Chicago's skyline, laughter had echoed in my ears. Tonight, there was only steady noise and deliberate breath. I hadn't destroyed anything. I had simply withdrawn protection. And once protection is withdrawn, truth does the work. The first invitation to speak on a panel arrived 3 weeks after the studio opening. It was a leadership summit focused on governance, creative entrepreneurship, and strategic resilience. I almost declined. Then I remembered the rooftop dinner. I accepted. The conference took place in a glass tower overlooking the Hudson. Executives, founders, consultants, investors, people who understood terms like valuation compression and compliance risk without explanation. I sat on stage beside a venture capitalist and a biotech founder who had survived a failed IPO. When it was my turn to speak, the moderator asked, "What was the most important lesson you learned during your transition from supporting role to independent founder?" I didn't hesitate. "Never sign anything you haven't read," I said. A few people laughed. I didn't. "Structures matter more than sentiment," I continued. "In business and in life." The room grew quieter. After the panel, several women approached me privately, not to gossip about Kevin, not to ask about the scandal. They asked about boundaries. They asked about how to protect themselves without appearing adversarial. They asked about how to stay silent without becoming invisible. I told them the truth. Silence is power only when you understand the system you're standing in. Back in Chicago, Kevin's company was stabilizing under cautious management. Quarterly reports were conservative. Investor communication was transparent to the point of overcorrection. The interim COO remained. Kevin's name still appeared on the leadership page, but rarely in headlines. I knew this not because I was tracking him obsessively, but because industry updates reached me organically. Reputation doesn't vanish overnight. It erodes in layers. One evening, I received an email from an old mutual friend. I heard Hannah is consulting for a smaller healthcare firm out west. Quiet role. No public visibility. I stared at the message for a long moment. Consulting. Quiet role. No public visibility. The symmetry was subtle. For months, she had stood beside Kevin in investor meetings, shaping narrative, pushing urgency, dismissing caution. Now she operated quietly in the background. There was no satisfaction in that. Just balance. A week later, Kevin flew to New York for a board-related meeting and asked if we could have coffee. I considered declining. Then I agreed. We met in a quiet cafe near my studio. He looked thinner, not broken, just recalibrated. "How's New York?" he asked. "Honest," I replied. He nodded faintly. "The company's steady," he said. "Not exciting, but steady. Steady survives," I answered. He looked at me carefully. "I was angry at you for a while," he admitted. "I know. I thought you wanted to ruin everything. I wanted accountability." He exhaled slowly. "I thought ambition meant acceleration at any cost," he said. "Hannah believed that too. And now I understand cost." The conversation wasn't romantic. It wasn't nostalgic. It was administrative closure between two people who had once built something together. I read the clause again. He said quietly, "I assumed you did. I didn't see it as a threat. It wasn't." He met my eyes. "It was protection." "Yes." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The barista called out an order behind us. Traffic hummed outside the window. "I'm not asking for anything," Kevin said. "I just wanted to say I understand now. Understanding doesn't reverse consequence." I replied, "I know." He finished his coffee and stood. "You were never ornamental," he said before leaving. I watched him walk out onto the sidewalk and disappear into the crowd. The words didn't undo anything, but they settled something. Later that week, a business journal published a short feature titled "From Undervalued to Unstoppable: How One Founder Reclaimed Structural Power." My photo appeared beside the headline. Not because of revenge, because of resilience. The narrative had shifted. The rooftop dinner had become a footnote in a larger story. The compliance review had become a case study. And the clause, once dismissed as unnecessary, was now referenced in governance discussions among early-stage founders. I hadn't just protected myself. I had modeled something. That realization felt heavier than satisfaction. It felt responsible. One night, alone in the studio after a long fitting session, I walked between garment racks slowly. Fabric brushed against my fingertips. Every design here had been drafted without compromise. Every partnership negotiated with clarity. Every contract reviewed personally. Outside, New York pulsed with its usual urgency. Inside, there was calm. I didn't think about Hannah often anymore. I didn't think about the laughter on the rooftop. What remained wasn't anger. It was structure. And once you understand structure, you don't fear collapse. You anticipate it. You prevent it. Or, if necessary, you allow it to happen where it must. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing production samples for our fall collection. It wasn't Kevin. It was the interim COO. "I hope I'm not overstepping," he said evenly. "But as a shareholder, you're entitled to hear this directly." I stepped into my office and closed the glass door. "I'm listening." "The board has voted to proceed with a partial sale of non-core assets to stabilize liquidity," he said. "Valuation will be significantly lower than the initial Series B projection." "How significant?" I asked. 40% below peak. 40%. The number didn't shock me. The speed did. "And Kevin?" I asked. "He retains minority equity. No executive authority beyond product advisory." Advisory. The word lingered in the air after the call ended. I stood still for a moment, absorbing the finality of it. The company wasn't collapsing. It was contracting, reshaping itself into something safer, smaller, less ambitious, less reckless. That evening, Kevin called. They're finalizing the asset sale, he said without preamble. I heard. He paused. So that's it. For this phase, I replied. He laughed quietly. Not with humor, but with resignation. I used to measure success by expansion, he said. Now I measure it by survival. That's growth too, I said. There was a long silence on the line. Do you ever regret triggering it? He asked. No. Another pause. I thought you were trying to punish me. I was trying to protect what was left. He didn't argue. In the days that followed, industry coverage shifted tone again. Reinhardt Health Tech completes strategic asset realignment. Compliance review concludes without criminal findings. Founder transitions to advisory role amid governance restructure. Neutral headlines. Clinical. Sanitized. The rooftop dinner never appeared in print. Hannah's name appeared once more in a compliance footnote, then disappeared entirely. She had become an administrative memory. Meanwhile, my own trajectory accelerated. A national retailer approached about licensing a limited capsule line. A medical conference invited me to consult on design standards for post-surgical wear. Fashion and healthcare intersecting again. But this time, on my terms. One evening, after a long fitting session, I sat alone in the studio with the city lights reflecting against the windows. My phone buzzed. Kevin again. They're offering me a buyout, he said. For your remaining shares? Yes. Will you take it? I don't know. The question carried more weight than financial implication. If he accepted, he would sever formal ties to the company he built. If he declined, he would remain attached to something that no longer belonged to him. What do you want? I asked. I don't know who I am without it, he admitted. The honesty surprised me. You're still the person who built it, I said. You're just not the only one shaping it anymore. He exhaled slowly. I didn't think it would end like this. It didn't end, I replied. It transformed. After we hung up, I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes briefly. The collapse I had imagined months earlier, if I had imagined one at all, would have been dramatic. Headlines, investigations, chaos. Instead, it had been procedural, systematic, measured. I hadn't detonated anything. I had exposed fault lines. And once exposed, structures either reinforce themselves or reconfigure. Kevin chose to accept the buyout 2 weeks later. His official statement read, I remain proud of what we built and confident in the company's future direction. Professional. Contained. When the funds transferred, he sent me a short message. It's done. I stared at the screen for a moment before responding. Then you're free. Freedom. The word felt strange between us. We had once equated freedom with expansion, with scaling, with rapid acceleration. Now it meant detachment. Later that month, I returned briefly to Chicago for a family obligation. Driving past the old apartment building felt surreal. The skyline looked the same. The rooftop restaurant still glowed at night. But the emotional charge was gone. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel triumph. I felt distance. Kevin and I met once more before I flew back to New York. We walked along the river in early evening light. I thought ambition meant never slowing down, he said. And now? I asked. Now I think ambition without structure is just risk. I nodded. That's why contracts exist, I said quietly. He almost smiled. You always saw the framework behind everything. Yes. And I ignored it. Yes. The conversation didn't drift into nostalgia. It didn't attempt repair. It acknowledged consequence. As I boarded my flight back to New York that night, I realized something unexpected. The company's decline had not brought me satisfaction. It had brought closure. Because the real collapse had not been financial. It had been relational. And that had ended long before the investors noticed. Back in my studio the next morning, sunlight flooded the space. Fabric caught the light in soft folds. My assistant asked about the trip. It was fine, I said. And it was because the chapter that began with laughter under the Chicago skyline had closed without explosion. Not with revenge shouted from rooftops, but with contracts honored, with accountability enforced, with power redefined. And sometimes that is the only kind of ending that lasts. 6 months after the rooftop dinner, my life no longer felt like a reaction. It felt intentional. The studio in New York had settled into rhythm. Morning fittings, afternoon consultations, late-night sketch revisions under soft industrial lighting. The space no longer echoed when I walked through it. It carried presence. My name appeared on contracts without attachment to anyone else's. Not Kevin's wife. Not co-founder's partner? Just mine. The medical aesthetics collaboration expanded faster than projected. Hospitals requested custom recovery garments. Surgeons referenced our design guidelines in patient consultations. A fashion publication described the line as where structure meets strategy. Structure. The word followed me everywhere now. I no longer avoided industry news about Kevin's former company, but I no longer sought it either. Updates arrived incidentally through mutual contacts and business newsletters. Reinhardt Health Tech had stabilized at a smaller scale. Revenue steady. Growth modest. Compliance processes praised in governance forums as a corrective model for emerging startups. Kevin's name appeared occasionally in advisory panels, no longer as visionary founder, but as case study and recalibration. He emailed once in late autumn. They're teaching parts of our compliance review in startup accelerators. I read the message without emotion. Lessons tend to outlive egos. Meanwhile, my own invitations multiplied. A university requested I guest lecture on entrepreneurial risk management. A venture capital group asked me to advise female founders negotiating early-stage equity. The irony never escaped me. For years, I had been labeled creative, aesthetic, intuitive. Now I was consulted on clauses, leverage, and structural risk. One evening, after a long meeting with potential international partners, I stayed late in the studio alone. The city lights flickered through the tall windows. Reflections layered against the glass, mannequins, racks of silk. My own silhouette. I remembered the rooftop toast in precise detail. The tilt of Kevin's glass. Hannah's red dress. The laughter. What struck me now wasn't the humiliation. It was how small it seemed compared to everything that followed. That night had felt explosive. But the real impact came from what I did afterward. I didn't scream. I didn't expose. I didn't retaliate publicly. I activated structure. And structure does not shout. It moves quietly until outcomes shift. A text buzzed on my phone. Kevin, I'm in New York next week for a conference. No pressure. Just thought I'd let you know. I stared at the screen for a moment before responding. I have a panel Thursday evening. Governance and growth strategy. His reply came quickly. That sounds right. We met briefly the following week after his conference session ended. Not for nostalgia. For acknowledgement. He looked different. Not defeated. Measured. The buyout was the right choice, he said as we walked through midtown traffic. I'm glad. I replied. I've started consulting independently, he added. Smaller projects. Transparent metrics. Transparent metrics. He said it like a mantra. I don't regret building the company, he continued. I regret believing speed justified shortcuts. Speed exposes fault lines, I said. It doesn't create them. He nodded slowly. You were always better at seeing cracks before they widened, he admitted. Yes, I answered simply. There was no bitterness left in either of us. Just clarity. When we parted ways on the sidewalk, I didn't feel loss. I felt completion. Back at the studio that evening, my team was preparing samples for an international showcase. One of the younger designers paused beside me. Do you ever wish things had unfolded differently? She asked casually, referring to an article she had read about corporate restructuring trends. She didn't mean Kevin. She meant risk. I considered the question carefully. No, I said finally, because unfolding reveals what was already there. She nodded, absorbing the idea. After everyone left, I stood alone once more in the quiet space. 6 months earlier, Phones had started ringing while laughter still echoed in my ears. Now, the only sound was the hum of city traffic and the faint rustle of fabric. The company I once helped build no longer depended on my silence. The marriage I once protected no longer depended on my patience. And I no longer depended on anyone else's validation. Success felt different now. Less urgent. More grounded. I hadn't climbed over anyone to reach this point. I had stepped aside and allowed gravity to do its work. Outside, the skyline stretched endless and bright. Not Chicago. New York. A different horizon. I locked the studio door and stepped into the night air. Steady and unhurried. The collapse people expected never happened. What happened instead was correction. And correction, unlike revenge, doesn't burn. It resets. 6 months later, I no longer woke up thinking about collapse. I woke up thinking about inventory, fittings, and the way morning light cut across the studio floor in precise angles. New York had stopped feeling temporary. The rhythm of the city no longer startled me. It matched my pace, measured, intentional, forward. The flagship studio had become more than an expansion. It was proof that I could build without compromise. Clients walked in expecting design. They left discussing structure. The partnership with the medical aesthetics group had evolved into a full-scale collaboration. Surgeons referenced our garments in patient recovery plans. Fashion editors described the line as disciplined elegance. Disciplined. That word followed me more than glamorous ever had. Kevin's company, meanwhile, operated quietly in the background of my life. Quarterly updates circulated through industry newsletters. Revenue steady. Growth modest. Compliance praised. The interim COO remained. Kevin's role was advisory only. Advisory. The transformation felt complete. One afternoon, I received a forwarded article from a venture capital contact. Reinhardt Health Tech. A case study in governance correction. I read the piece without emotion. It outlined the compliance review, the restructuring, the asset sale, and the eventual stabilization. It described the company's recalibration as a disciplined retreat from overextension. Overextension. That had once been ambition. Now it was caution. The article mentioned Kevin by name. It did not mention Hannah. Some narratives erase themselves. Later that evening, Kevin called. "I saw the article," he said. "I did too. They're framing it as a lesson." "It is." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't hate that version of the story," he admitted. "Good. I used to think reputation was everything," he continued. "Now I think integrity is." I didn't respond immediately, because integrity had always been the point. The divorce had finalized months earlier without spectacle. Asset division completed. Paperwork archived. No courtroom drama. The end had been administrative, which felt appropriate. The real fracture had never been loud. It had been incremental. The first time he dismissed my opinion. The first time he laughed. The first time he chose acceleration over accountability. That fracture had widened long before the audit. One evening after a long client consultation, I stayed in the studio alone. Lights dimmed low. I walked slowly between garment racks, fingers grazing fabric. The city hummed outside, constant and indifferent. I thought about the rooftop dinner again. Not the humiliation. The silence. Kevin's silence. That had been the betrayal. Hannah's laughter had been predictable. Investors laughing had been opportunistic. But his silence had been choice. And silence, when paired with power, becomes permission. My phone buzzed. A message from Kevin. "I never asked you something. I waited. Why didn't you warn me before activating the clause?" I read the question twice. "Because I already had..." He called immediately after I didn't reply. "What do you mean?" he asked. "You ignored every warning before that night," I said calmly. "The expense discrepancies. The vendor questions. The Aspen trip." He exhaled slowly. "I thought you were overreacting." "Yes." "And I thought I could manage it." "Yes." Another pause. "I didn't think you'd walk away," he admitted. "I didn't either." The truth settled between us without tension. "I don't blame you anymore," he said quietly. "I know. I blamed you because it was easier than admitting I ignored structure." Yes. The word felt final. After we hung up, I leaned against the cutting table and closed my eyes briefly. There was no satisfaction in hearing him acknowledge it. Just closure. The studio had become symbolic in ways I hadn't anticipated. Clients told me they felt calm inside the space. Investors described it as intentional. Intentional. That was the difference between collapse and correction. I had not sought destruction. I had sought alignment. And alignment required removing what distorted it. Weeks later, a leadership podcast invited me to speak about silent leverage. I agreed. During the interview, the host asked, "What's the most powerful move you made during that period?" I withdrew protection. I answered, "Not the audit, not the clause. Protection. When you stop shielding someone from the consequences of their own choices, the system recalibrates on its own." The episode circulated widely. Kevin texted afterward, "That line will follow me for a long time." I smiled faintly. It wasn't a threat. It was truth. The following weekend, I walked along the Hudson alone, wind cutting sharply across the water. 6 months earlier, I had been sitting at a rooftop table while laughter echoed behind me. Now, there was only open sky and steady breath. Kevin had not been destroyed. His company had not collapsed into scandal. Hannah had not faced public disgrace. Everything had simply adjusted to reality. And reality, once illuminated, doesn't negotiate. It settles. As I turned back toward the city, I realized something unexpected. The story was no longer about revenge. It was about visibility. I had become visible to myself again. And once you see yourself clearly, you no longer accept distortion. The phones had stopped ringing months ago. The headlines had faded. What remained was structure. And I was standing firmly inside it. I locked the studio door later than usual that night and stood for a moment in the quiet hallway, listening to the hum of the building settling. The city outside was restless as always. But inside, everything felt aligned. 6 months had passed since the rooftop dinner in Chicago. 6 months since laughter floated over a table of investors and champagne glasses, while my marriage fractured in silence. If someone had asked me that night what revenge would look like, I might have imagined something louder. Public disgrace. Headlines. Collapse. But that isn't what happened. What happened was slower. Cleaner. More precise. Kevin's company still exists. Smaller. Disciplined. Careful. He consults now, advising founders on governance structures and risk management. I've seen his name attached to panels about compliance and sustainable scaling. The irony doesn't sting anymore. Hannah resurfaced briefly in a quiet consulting role. No public statements. No dramatic apology. Just a professional recalibration. And me, I built something steady. The studio in New York is no longer just a workspace. It's a framework. Every contract I sign, I read. Every partnership I enter, I structure carefully. Every expansion decision is grounded in clarity. I no longer rush growth. I engineer it. There are nights when I still remember the rooftop clearly. The way Kevin tilted his glass. The way Hannah's red dress caught the light. The sound of investors laughing when he said I should leave scaling to people who understood tech. What strikes me now isn't the insult. It's the assumption. They assumed I didn't understand structure. They assumed my silence meant ignorance. They assumed creativity meant fragility. They were wrong. I didn't shout. I didn't expose secrets to tabloids. I didn't sabotage. I activated a clause that already existed. I stopped protecting someone from the consequences of his own decisions. And once I did that, the system adjusted. That's the part people rarely talk about. Revenge doesn't always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like stepping aside and letting gravity work. One afternoon recently, a young founder visited my studio after hearing me speak at a leadership summit. "I'm afraid of protecting myself too aggressively," she admitted. "I don't want to seem distrustful." I understood that fear. I once thought protection meant conflict. Now I know it means clarity. If someone respects you, I told her, they won't be threatened by your boundaries. She nodded slowly, absorbing it. That conversation stayed with me. Because the real lesson of everything that happened isn't about Kevin. It isn't about Hannah. It isn't even about the company. It's about underestimation. When someone underestimates you, they reveal more about their blind spots than your limitations. And when you underestimate yourself, you allow their narrative to become yours. That was the real danger. Not the laughter. Not the compliance review. Not the restructuring. The danger was believing I was ornamental. I wasn't. I never was. Tonight, as I walk back through the studio one last time before turning off the lights, I run my fingers along a line of finished garments, precise seams, reinforced structure, fabric chosen not just for beauty but for durability. That's what I build now. Beauty with structure, ambition with safeguards, power with accountability. Outside, the skyline stretches endless and illuminated. It's not Chicago. It's New York. A different city. A different chapter. The rooftop dinner is no longer an open wound. It's a turning point. If you've ever been underestimated, if someone has laughed while dismissing what you bring to the table, if you've stayed silent because you thought keeping peace mattered more than keeping power, I want you to remember something. Silence is not weakness, but silence without structure is vulnerability. Know your contracts. Know your leverage. Know your worth. And when the moment comes, when the laughter feels sharp and public and humiliating, ask yourself one question. Are you protecting them? Or are you protecting yourself? Sometimes the most powerful move you'll ever make isn't retaliation. It's withdrawal of protection. If this story resonated with you, if you've lived through something similar or learned something from it, share your thoughts below. I read every comment. And if you're drawn to stories about quiet strength, hidden leverage, and the kind of revenge that doesn't burn but resets, stay here. There are more stories like this. Because sometimes the most powerful endings are the ones no one sees coming. They laughed under the Chicago skyline. I walked away with the light switch. And once the light is on, everything changes. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.